Hello, my name is Palma Accardi, and you are watching Tidal Flooding Talk. We are brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition and filmed live every Sunday here at the Irish Pub in Atlantic City. I'm sure you are wondering, where is Dan Skeldon? Because we are on Dan's Facebook page, but he's feeling under the weather tonight, and he's dealing with a lot of snow where he is a meteorologist. But tonight we have a very special guest for you, a New Jersey architect, Dan Mascione, who's been an architect for over 20 years now. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure.
Big shoes to fill. I'll try to be the other Dan.
Yeah.
Dan.
Temporarily replace Dan with another Dan.
Yeah.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the construction industry?
Sure. I think my earliest memories, I've always wanted to be an architect, so it's the only thing I've ever really wanted to do. And I graduated from Pratt Institute in 1992 and spent a lot of time working for different architects over the years in the South Jersey area. And eventually, in 1995, I became licensed and started my own firm. And since then, we've been practicing in Northfield, New Jersey.
How was that transition going from working for a different company and then?
It was interesting. I mean, it's always hard to start a business, and I think it's harder now than it was back then. But it was difficult. We were blessed with a good economy at the time, so we moved forward. And I've been working. One of my associates has been with me almost from the beginning, so it's been a good collaboration, and we took off from there. So we've been successful. There's been some lean years, but overall it's been good. After I got out of college, one of the first things while I was doing my internship, a 3-year internship for architecture, I realized that I needed to go back to college, and I became a building official for building inspectors. And then I got certified to teach by the state of New Jersey, that program. I just felt it was really important. It's one of the things, weak on the education as an architect coming out that we needed to reinforce. So I spent time at Atlantic Cape Community College teaching, being an instructor for the building codes. And I do continue education for architects and engineers for Half Moon, continuing education all over the state of New Jersey.
Now, were you actually a building official for a municipality, or just studied it? And
yeah, I studied it and passed the tests, and I do a lot of code consulting to other architects with life safety and different types of projects when they get larger. So I've worked on, through my internship and through my experience, I've worked on projects of all scales, from casinos to schools to food bank, funeral parlors, 4-story miniature golf courses. Quite a wide range. It was interesting.
Sounds fun.
It is. It is.
Now, our show is about flooding. So how does your profession deal with flood mitigation?
Well, with every design, it has to be responsive to the environment that it's in. So if you're in a flood zone, of course, you have to be aware of the regulations and the information that's available, and that information does change. The maps change.
How frequently?
More information. Well, it depends on the municipality. New maps do come out, but some municipalities have maps from the 1980s, and they don't change very frequently. But you try to get the latest information so that you can make decisions in design to protect the property and most of the life safety of the individuals.
So does that start at your point?
Yes.
In terms of a new construction project, it starts with the design. Almost
any project almost starts with gathering the criteria for the site, and that includes flood, really. And there's not only flooding from the tidal flooding, which is we're here to talk about, but riverine flooding, and then there's just drainage. It becomes an issue too on sites, so that can cause flooding as well. In New Jersey, we do have some clay in our soils in different parts, and sometimes we don't have well-draining soils, which can cause a problem on a site. So it does affect the design of whatever the building may be, if it's a residence or a commercial building.
Now, I believe that you specialize in commercial design, right?
A little more than residential, yeah.
Okay.
We do residential, but
right.
Yeah, about a third of our work.
Now, how do the two differ in terms of flood protection? These commercial grand scale projects compared to the residential?
Well, in general, a residential project, you're allowed to lift out of the flood zone, or you're required, I should say, not say allowed. You're required to keep above any kind of floodwaters. Where in commercial, you're allowed to build below the flood elevation, but you have to flood-proof it. Because in a commercial construction, you really are also concerned with accessibility for people to get in and out of the building. So it's not always advantageous to lift a building, 10 feet off the ground, a retail center, and have people try to, traverse going up 10 feet, especially with accessibility and different needs. We also have that problem, it does relate back to the residential as well, because while we're lifting houses up and down the Jersey Shore ever since the big, Superstorm Sandy, we have an aging population, and accessibility into the homes becomes an issue in design too, because how do we get people up into the homes, with a flight of stairs? So there's a lot of design challenges in both, but they're attacked a little bit differently. The commercial end ends up being put closer to your normal grade, where you can readily get into a building, and then dry flood-proofed with some kind of gate or other technology. And the technology is changing. They have some amazing new types of materials that we can use, and different ways and methods to accomplish that. So.
Now, for these commercial structures to flood-proof them, does that rule also apply to the existing commercial structures, or is it really just the new ones that are being built now?
It does get complicated in an existing structure, because there's a balance in the regulations where you want to preserve some of the art. You don't want to tear everything down and start anew. You want to preserve the buildings that are there, but yet you do want to protect something that's been flooded multiple times. So if you're gone beyond substantial improvement, or you've done a tremendous amount of work, sometimes there are additional requirements that you do have to dry flood-proof a building, but not always. So it depends on really the size and scale and the renovation.
Now, for the residential aspect, do you think that most of your clients are happy to meet those standards with the hut being up so high, or is it more of a challenge?
I think in general, they are if they have been flooded. So we've done several projects where people have had multiple flooding events, and it gets tiresome. Obviously, if your home's in a flood zone, and you want to protect your home, you want your items to be safe, so they want to be lifted up. Others see it as an impediment because it's a cost to their homes, and you'll hear that there's well, we've never been flooded here, and we spoke about it a little bit before. In New Jersey, it's kind of a generational storm cycle where you have storms every 20 years or so, maybe a little more. So people tend to forget, and homes turn over, and we, from that aspect, it's difficult to motivate some to really comply or try to spend money for something that's unknown to them. But you do see it. I always try to make the comparison of the architecture up and down the East Coast, where the further south you go, where there's more repetitive storms, you see the actual architecture change. You see things up higher on pilings, open underneath. Now, some of that's they have an advantage for climate. We do freeze in this area, so we also have to design for the freezing and the thawing. But you'll see that in like Carolina Beach, we mentioned that things are up a story and parking underneath. And while in New Jersey, a lot of the island towns are not discernible from the inland towns. They look the same architecturally, which after a few storms, you realize that really shouldn't be.
Now, you did mention pilings, and I think we're seeing that more often now with the new construction. What is your take on pilings? Do you think that they are necessary, and what are their benefits? Well,
I think what we found, and regulations are constantly changing. They've kind of expanded the zone where you do need pilings, or suggested that you need pilings, because they found even though the wave heights might be down a little bit lower that they calculate, it still can cause harm to the structure. And really, with any flooding event, whether it's a riverine flooding or a tidal event, you have what's called scouring, which is where the water just, even if it's settling around the building, it will settle unevenly. You get liquefaction of the soil. Can't say that word. So, we had a lot in Sandy. A lot of homes that may not have been in a typical area where you would need pilings, but after they flooded, when all was said and done, they had footings that settled and cracked foundations and a lot of repairs to be done.
So the pilings would deter that from happening?
Would, yeah, it would. And other designs, maybe a slightly, less conventional, larger footing or something may help with that in some way. So we have to be aware, I think. If you track the construction along the coast, it comes in spurts, and they do something for a certain amount of time, and then they find out that that maybe that's not the optimal way to do it, and it slightly changes. Years ago, I had a radio show where we would do a hurricane show every year and go through the hurricanes. But one of my guests on that show was from Ireland, and it was interesting because his home, when we were discussing it, was 400 years old, his family home. So we don't really have that in this, readily in this area. And that just really strikes you as something different where, that structure's been there for 400 years. And we tend to look at the life of the mortgage and a little more disposable, the construction, which is a shame because we want to make it sustainable and resilient.
But with these new codes, do you think they are going to be more sustainable and last longer than the previous home that was there?
They're getting more restrictive, and as I said, with a generational storm over my career, what I've seen was when I started in the 80s, really, it was fairly strict, the regulations, and then it tends to soften as we get further away from the storms, and then the storm hits, and again we get another round of regulations. It's my thought that we really should look at it holistically and have a fairly strict regulation of raising the homes and getting as far away from the flood waters as possible. But many shore towns are very concerned through planning and zoning of the heights of buildings, which always been my argument is the height is we need to get the buildings away from the floodwaters. That's the primary thing, rather than maybe a couple feet on the height of the overall building.
Now, I'm sure you work in several municipalities, both on the island and offshore. Are there differences between the municipalities for codes and regulations, or are they all pretty much on the same?
For flood, as you know, we have a community rating system which gives advantages or benefits to having stricter regulations, which I think on paper works excellent. But in practice, I guess what we are learning is that it is complicated and it's a lot of record keeping, and you have 563 municipalities in New Jersey, all with differing levels of compliance. It becomes hard to practice because every town has a slightly different way of treating something. We don't always have the same way we're measuring height of a building or area on a lot. I think it would help if we had something that was a little more uniform. I think for a while the state tried to do that, but the community rating system is making it towns adopt stricter regulations, which is very good. Because we really should be higher than we are.
And floods don't really see municipal boundaries.
No, right, exactly. Yeah, you could be on the same island and have different laws, right? Yeah. And that's when you get, it's hard, I think, as professionals, one of the things we do is try to educate the public. And so we're constantly trying to, explain why things are the way they are. And regulations do change, and for good reason. We learn things, but we need to try to spend more time with the general public, making them aware of the different factors of flooding. Not only from just hurricanes, because that's the big one we see on television.
But it's more than that. We experience flooding throughout the entire year.
Yep.
Hurricanes or no hurricanes.
30% of flooding happens in non-flood zones. So, I mean, so
which
it's,
is scary because a lot of people that are not in a flood zone wouldn't carry flood insurance because they're not required to.
Right. In other parts of the country, I was in Colorado where you have a dry riverbed, and it might rain in a different part of the Rockies, and next thing you know, there's a flash flood rolling down, and it's a flood hazard. So you have to be really aware. And we're blessed in this way that with the meteorologists, we see the hurricanes coming, and hurricanes move fairly slowly, so we have time to get prepared.
And I think that is a shout out to Dan Skeldon,
exactly.
who is
I was trying to
most likely watching.
Hopefully tying him back in.
And whoever is watching, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the comments, and I will try to get to them. That's usually Dan Skeldon that handles that portion, but I will do my best.
For one hand short.
So, since you are still a building inspector or instructor, correct? Mm-hmm. So does that help you keep up with the building codes and the changes that are happening all the time?
It does. It forces me to try to really take a lot of continuing education and then and instruction, try to keep everyone up to date. And it's interesting to see things that are proposed and really what the stakeholders are that create, whether it's the insurance agencies or government or homeowners or product manufacturers, and who comes up with the regulations and then how they get promulgated and how we put them into effect. It's a constant challenge. It's gotten, I could say, exponentially more complicated in the last 25 years. So.
Now, I believe most of the people watching are homeowners that would be interested in knowing, for their existing properties, what are some cost-effective ways to make their home more resilient of flooding?
Well, I think in general, I mean, depending on the age of the home, you really want to look at the materials that could be damaged by winds in a flooding event, that can then hit other homes. But from a flooding perspective, your crawl spaces, if you don't have existing flood vents, to install flood vents. If you're able to bring up the levels of your crawl spaces even to the outside, that will help a lot. Keeping moisture out of a building is a constant battle, not only from flood waters, but to from all aspects. So that probably, other than lifting your home, of course you can lift your home, and try to pull the finished floor out of the flooding zone, which is the best, ultimately the best thing to do.
So, if someone were interested in doing something like that, whether it is a home elevation or flood vents, could they contact you directly to inquire about their specific structure?
Yeah, we do the research, and we would try to assist them and see what the regulations are, and they are always changing. As you know, the maps are changing again. How we measure, from what distance we measure, that's changing as well. But it's good to be aware of where you're at, and as far as really having flood insurance is probably one. Not to be an advocate of the insurance agency, but you really need to protect yourself as far as having flood insurance. So know where your building's set now, and have a plan, and protect yourself when the storm comes. Try to be prepared.
And in regards to flood insurance, even if you don't elevate, if you do something like the flood vents, that would help your, policy go down.
Right. You really should, and there should be more education on that for your typical homeowner, and there's some guides to it, for people to really be able to look at their house, and sometimes the insurance agencies are proactive with that, depending on who's your agents. But that's something we all need to do at the shore, because right now we're still in the shadow of Sandy, and as we get further away, we forget, and things tend to go into the past.
Right. So, in terms of new construction, what are some of the other ways that they're implementing these flood protection rules?
Well, with the community rating system, we're constantly being, things are being updated. Towns are looking at it and evaluating, their heights and their policies and trying to make it more restrictive, which is good. Though it's a moving target, so sometimes you're in the middle of a project and regulations will change, which is difficult. Sometimes there were towns where we've lifted 100 homes and they passed an ordinance and they're all below the flood elevation already. So it's difficult. So I urge the planners and everyone to really look at that. I think they've always looked at the island towns more, not from an elevation, aspect, and that really has to be taken seriously. And as we discussed before, if you go to the south, the space below homes are used for a lot of parking, which on a barrier island solves another problem. So there are ways.
Parking problem.
Yeah, right. So there solves another way. If we're able to raise a home just a foot or two more, you can get a car underneath, and it becomes advantageous to the community from other factors. So it's not, flooding is clearly one of the things, but it all takes part of the whole project, designing the entire.
Now, designing a structure just off of a coastal island, right offshore. Do they still take into consideration the possibility of a flood, or is it like the codes regarding floods are completely?
Well, there's almost flood zones everywhere. Yeah, I mean they may not be coastal, but there's riverines. There's the watershed. How the hydrology works, and it flows to the ocean eventually. Everything goes to the ocean. You will get flood zones, in every county. There's nothing that's exempt. So you have to be careful.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to see if we have any questions. I love the festivity we have beautiful. Now. This was not up last week, so yeah. If you haven't came to the Irish pub since, they've decorated it completely for Christmas, and it's really nice. We have a lot of hellos. Will Brunetti, Jane Christie, Angela Accardi, Layla Gonzalez, Carmen Martinez, Peter Griffin, hello. Tom Sullivan says Dan Mascione is one of the best in the business.
Wow. And he has a face for radio. That's what I've been told.
And Lou wants to know, how are buildings changed when they are in a flood zone?
How are they changed?
How are buildings changed?
Once they've been constructed, we can pick up a whole structure and raise it. If it's a commercial building, we can flood-proof it. Sometimes as it stands. So there's a lot of different mitigation factors that we could use.
I guess I could go from that. How have they changed since Superstorm Sandy? Has it drastically changed?
I don't think so. I think almost just the elevation has changed. It's become a little more strict, and hopefully people are paying more and more attention to it. As a homeowner, if you have a space below your home that is 6 or 7 feet, and you turn it into a storage area, you may not realize that it's going to flood someday, and that's going to be can be a problem. One thing we know is that in the next 50 years, the coastline's not going to look like it did, today, because the coastline's always changing. So we have to, try to design with resiliency and just be aware of that, respect the ocean. So I wanted to give this to you for thanking you for allowing me on. It's a megalodon shark tooth.
I've never gotten a gift before.
Yeah. This is a megalodon shark tooth.
Wow.
I'm an avid scuba diver, along with some.
That's really great.
Yep.
Thank you.
And one of the things that I learned diving, we find those about 30 miles off of North Carolina, off the beach.
And does this scare you, or
scuba diving?
Continue looking for more?
Well, I do. I have some more, but. What's interesting is with those teeth, we also find land mammal teeth. So we know the ocean was out that far, what was pulled back. So we know over the years things are going to change. So it's just something to think about. And hopefully, a megalodon won't show up in the next flood.
Hope not.
Well,
I do have a gift in return, but it's not just from me. It's from the New Jersey Coastal Coalition and the Irish Pub.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, an Irish Pub t-shirt, so you can wear it.
Thank you so much.
And any last words of advice or anything
Oh,
for
no,
our
I
viewers?
just want to thank you and the organization for having me on, giving me the opportunity. It's
And
an
again,
honor.
where is your office
Oh,
located?
I'm located in Northfield, New Jersey, and I appreciate the opportunity. It was an honor, and
Thank you,
anything
Dan.
I do to help, it'd be great.
Thank you. And good night, everyone. We will not be here next Sunday. We will be celebrating the Thanksgiving holiday, but you could look for us the next week. So thank you again.